The dawn over northeastern Europe in the summer of 1410 was muted, almost reluctant. Mist clung to the flat field between the Vistula River and the rolling forests of Masovia, as though the land itself hesitated to witness the coming storm. In villages scattered across the region, the faint clatter of cartwheels and the low voices of peasants and minor gentry carried on the wind. Yet beneath these ordinary sounds, a much larger tension had begun to coalesce, an undercurrent of imminent violence that would soon erupt into one of the largest battles of the late Middle Ages. For decades, the Teutonic Order had projected an aura of unassailable power. From their fortress cities, carved out of the wilderness, they had imposed a rigid military and administrative system across Prussia, Riga, and much of what is today northeastern Poland and the Kaliningrad region. Their knights were not merely soldiers. They were an ideological force, bound by religious vows, trained in the disciplined precision of war, and confident in the invincibility of their armored formations. To challenge them was to confront a machine honed over generations, steeped in the belief that divine providence guided their conquests. Yet by 1410, the Order's dominance had begun to fray at the edges. Economic strains, internal political rivalries, and a growing coalition of dissatisfied statesmen and mercantile towns had begun to form a network of opposition. At the heart of this rising tide was the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, an alliance forged less by idealism than by necessity. Under King Władysław II Jagiełło, Poland had begun consolidating military strength and administrative cohesion, while Vytautas, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, had sharpened the long-standing Lithuanian cavalry into a formidable and flexible force, capable of operating both in tight formations and in rapid, unpredictable maneuvers. In the months leading to July, the Polish-Lithuanian alliance had moved carefully. Diplomatic channels buzzed with tension. Emissaries and spies slipped across borders, negotiating ceasefires that were never intended to last and probing the vulnerabilities of Teutonic garrisons. Every decision carried weight. One misstep could provoke the Order into preemptive action, yet hesitation risked ceding initiative to the enemy. Strategy in this context was not abstract. It was a psychological contest, a game of nerve and perception, where both sides weighed not only armies but morale, reputation, and the subtle interplay of honor and fear. The Teutonic Order, confident in their numbers and discipline, had underestimated the complexity of the Polish-Lithuanian approach. They assumed that open battle would favor them. Their knights, trained to hold the center, armored to withstand arrows and charges alike, would be able to dictate the pace of the fight. But what the Order could not see clearly, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was the careful orchestration that lay behind their enemies' movements, a strategy that relied on deception, terrain, and the precise timing of multiple contingents converging on the battlefield. It was a strategy that had been built over months of reconnaissance and logistical preparation. Jagiełło and Vytautas understood that a frontal collision with Teutonic heavy cavalry could be catastrophic. They could not simply meet the knights on equal terms. Instead, they drew on knowledge accumulated from prior skirmishes and irregular warfare that had long been a hallmark of Lithuanian military tradition. The army would be arrayed not as a single mass, but as a network of interdependent units, each with a defined role, yet capable of independent action. Mobility would be as critical as force. Speed, patience, and anticipation would determine the outcome far more than sheer brute strength. The terrain itself played into this strategy. The battlefield near Grunwald, a patchwork of fields, forests, and marshes, offered both opportunity and peril. Knights charging at full tilt could find their formations disrupted by boggy ground, while lightly armored units could exploit narrow passes, and wooded flanks are harass, encircle, or withdraw without catastrophic loss. Jagiełło and Vytautas took these variables into account, instructing their commanders to maintain cohesion while remaining flexible, an approach that contrasted sharply with the rigid, linear tactics favored by the Teutonic Order. Even before armies met, psychological pressures were mounting. For the Order, rumors of Polish-Lithuanian preparations seeped into their consciousness, sparking a mix of arrogance and unease. The mental framework of a knightly elite is a delicate balance of courage and pride. It thrives on the certainty of superiority. The knowledge that an enemy might be plotting a maneuver that could outwit, rather than simply outfight, them was deeply unsettling. For the Polish-Lithuanian side, confidence was tempered with caution. A premature engagement could result in disaster. Yet hesitation risked losing the initiative altogether. Each commander had to weigh not only enemy movements, but the morale of their own troops, the timing of reinforcements, and the inherent unpredictability of medieval warfare, where a single misjudged charge or misread signal could unravel months of planning. The buildup of forces in late June and early July reflected this meticulous care. Scouts moved ahead of the main body, mapping the ground, noting marshes, and testing the reaction times of Teutonic garrisons. Supply lines were established, not just for immediate provisions, but to sustain a campaign that could last weeks if necessary. Wagons laden with grain, water, and siege equipment threaded cautiously along hidden paths, avoiding major roads where ambush was possible. Communication networks were established using messengers and prearranged signals, flags, horns, and even smoke from distant fires, to coordinate units separated by kilometers of terrain. Every measure was taken to mitigate the chaos that inevitably accompanies a large, multi-pronged medieval army on the move. Meanwhile, the Teutonic Order pursued their own preparations with characteristic rigor. Castles and fortified towns served as both logistical hubs and psychological anchors, projecting strength across the landscape. Knights drilled incessantly. Squires learned the timing of mounted formations. Crossbowmen practiced volley fire with exacting precision. Yet in their focus on discipline and tradition, a subtle rigidity crept in, a reliance on predictable tactics that would later be exploited by an enemy whose ingenuity relied on adaptability. By mid-July, the armies of Poland and Lithuania had converged near the village of Grunwald. Historical accounts emphasize the numerical strength. Estimates suggest a combined force of approximately 39,000 men, including heavy cavalry, light horse, and infantry, facing a Teutonic army of roughly 27,000, composed predominantly of well-armored knights supported by foot soldiers and mercenaries. But numbers alone tell only part of the story. The critical element was coordination, the invisible threads linking units into a cohesive, responsive whole. Each division had a designated function. Some were bait, some were anchors, some would exploit weaknesses once the enemy committed. The plan was ambitious, but it carried a psychological edge to induce overconfidence in Teutonic commanders, to lure them into committing prematurely, and then to systematically dismantle their cohesion. The night before battle was restless. Campfires flickered against the forest edge, casting elongated shadows on the damp grass. Soldiers, both experienced and green, were caught between anticipation and fear. For many, this would be the first sustained encounter with the famed Teutonic Knights, whose reputation for discipline and ruthlessness preceded them. Sleep was fitful, murmurs of strategy and rumor intertwined. Leaders moved quietly through the ranks, checking positions, conveying orders, and silently reinforcing the mindset they wished to instill. Patience under pressure, focus amid uncertainty, and readiness to act decisively when the moment arrived. This convergence of geography, psychology, and strategy set the stage for what would unfold at Grunwald. The battle would not be won merely through superior strength or individual heroics. It would be decided through anticipation, the careful orchestration of multiple forces, and the subtle manipulation of enemy expectations. The secret that would ultimately break the Teutonic Order lay not in overwhelming force, but in an understanding of their rigidity, their reliance on predictable tactics, and the timing of intervention. Every decision, from the placing of the units to the choice of when to strike, was calibrated with an almost clinical precision, yet the human element, fear, pride, confusion, remained an unpredictable variable. As dawn approached on the morning of July 15th, 1410, the mist began to lift. The fields of Grunwald lay quiet but tense, waiting for the sound of hoofbeats, the clatter of armor, and the first arrow loosed into the fog. Across the lines, both sides prepared to assert control over the field, yet only one had fully embraced the complexity of the engagement. In the minds of the Polish and Lithuanian commanders, every hour, every unit, and every maneuver had a purpose. They understood that the battle would be a test of nerve, strategy, and endurance, a confrontation in which the outcome would hinge not on luck, but on the disciplined execution of a plan that could exploit the fatal vulnerabilities of their seemingly invincible adversary. And so, on that humid summer morning, history held its breath. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only decide a war, but would reveal the power of strategic subtlety over brute force, and expose the cracks beneath the armor of the Teutonic Order cracks that had been deliberately prepared for years. The morning mist that clung to the fields of Grunwald began to burn away as the first movements of the battle unfolded. From a distance, the two armies appeared as vast, undulating masses of color and steel, yet closer inspection revealed the intricate choreography that would define the day. The Polish-Lithuanian forces, arrayed with deliberate care, presented a formation that combined rigidity at the center with elasticity on the flanks. Each unit had been instructed not merely to hold position, but to respond dynamically, to observe and exploit, and to act when the enemy exposed the weaknesses the commanders had patiently prepared for. At the heart of the Polish army, King Władysław Jagiełło assumed command of the Central Division. His presence was less about personal heroics and more about the psychological and organizational weight it carried. Around him were units of heavy cavalry, knights who were disciplined but not as armored as their Teutonic counterparts, trained to support and stabilize the line rather than break into it recklessly. Jagiełło's infantry, composed largely of peasants, mercenaries, and lightly armored soldiers, formed the line's backbone, capable of absorbing the initial shock of the charge, holding ground long enough for the flanking maneuvers to take effect. On the left flank, the Lithuanian forces under Vytautas were positioned with striking precision. Here was mobility incarnate. Lightly armored cavalry, capable of rapid advance or retreat, interspersed with spearmen and archers. Vytautas knew that the Teutonic Knights' greatest strength, their mass charge, could be turned against them if channeled into terrain that slowed or funneled their advance. Forest edges, small rises, and shallow bogs were all exploited to create points where the heavy knights could not deploy fully, where their momentum could be blunted without committing the Polish-Lithuanian forces prematurely. Opposite them, the Teutonic Order had arranged their army in a manner that reflected centuries of military doctrine. The main body of knights, each encased in plate and bearing the emblem of the cross, formed a dense, nearly immovable block. Their aim was direct confrontation, to strike with overwhelming force, break enemy lines, and pursue the rout with disciplined cavalry. Foot soldiers and archers were positioned to support, yet the formation was linear and heavily dependent on cohesion. Any breach, hesitation, or flank attack would be met with difficulty, as the Teutonic strategy favored straightforward aggression over adaptive maneuvering. As the first signals were given, arrows arced across the field, striking lightly armored units and testing responses. Skirmishes erupted along the edges, small detachments probing, retreating, and drawing attention. For the Teutonic Knights, this was a familiar pattern. Harassment meant to disrupt, yet the Polish-Lithuanian commanders had anticipated this. Each provocation was a controlled element of a larger plan. Vytautas allowed certain attacks to proceed, drawing knights into positions where the terrain and the unseen units waiting in ambush would later become deadly. The battlefield itself began to assert its role. Open fields invited charge, but marshy areas slowed horses, creating vulnerable points. Slight rises in the ground offered observational advantage, yet could isolate units if overextended. Dense forest edges concealed flanking detachments, and narrow tracks allowed light cavalry to strike suddenly and vanish. The Polish-Lithuanian forces had studied this landscape for weeks. Each movement was calculated to manipulate the enemy into overconfidence and positional errors. At approximately mid-morning, the first major engagement occurred. Teutonic Knights surged forward in their classic wedge formation, intent on piercing the center of the Polish line. The impact was immense. Armor horses collided with infantry. Steel met pike and shield, and the ground trembled under the weight of men and animals alike. Yet what appeared at first glance as a brutal head-on clash was, in reality, the careful execution of a multi-layered strategy. Polish infantry absorbed the charge in depth, trading ground methodically while minimizing catastrophic losses. Archers and crossbowmen exploited slight openings, targeting horses and riders to reduce the momentum of the assault. On the flanks, Vytautas' cavalry maneuvered with fluidity that contrasted sharply with the Teutonic rigidity. Units feigned retreat to draw knights into marshy ground, only to turn and harry them with arrows and light lances. These movements were designed to stretch the Teutonic line, to force the enemy into overextension, and to create points where coordination would falter. Every reaction of the knights was monitored and anticipated. The Polish-Lithuanian commanders did not merely respond. They choreographed the enemy's behavior, Communication across the battlefield was both subtle and critical. Horns, flags, and mounted messengers carried signals, yet the effectiveness relied on trained interpretation. Commanders needed to read not only the messages but the changing patterns of battle, where morale faltered, where units hesitated, where gaps emerged. The psychological dimension was as important as the physical clash of arms. Teutonic Knights, confident in their superiority, were beginning to encounter confusion. Their central advance met unexpected resistance. Their flanks were probed, and small but persistent attacks disrupted their sense of control. By late morning, the battle had become a grinding, chaotic engagement. Yet beneath the apparent disorder lay methodical control. Polish and Lithuanian units had absorbed and redirected the enemy's momentum. Controlled withdrawals on the flanks drew knights into disadvantageous positions. Infantry held points critical to cohesion, preventing a breakthrough that would have been disastrous. The battlefield, vast yet tightly studied, functioned as a tool of strategy, channeling forces in ways the Teutonic Order could neither anticipate nor counter effectively. In the psychological theater of war, perception mattered as much as reality. Reports of flanking maneuvers, combined with the unexpected resilience of the Polish-Lithuanian center, sowed doubt among the knights. They were trained to expect submission, to overpower, to rout. Instead, they met resistance carefully calibrated to appear flexible yet resolute. Subtle misalignments of unit placement, slight delays in reinforcement, and carefully timed counterattacks began to erode confidence. The knights' cohesion, central to their tactical doctrine, was being tested in ways their rigid formations were ill-equipped to absorb. Throughout the morning, both sides sustained casualties, yet the crucial factor was not immediate loss, but position and momentum. Polish-Lithuanian forces, though numerically superior, maintained discipline and avoided rash engagement. Teutonic forces, though elite, were beginning to encounter fractures in command. Signals were misread, orders conflicted under pressure, and the sheer weight of expectation, a victory seen as inevitable, introduced a subtle tension that would soon amplify into vulnerability. As the sun climbed, the Polish-Lithuanian strategy revealed its subtlety. Units that had been withheld from the front began to move, exploiting overextended enemy positions. Light cavalry, unseen in initial engagement, struck from the forest edges and rear approaches. Teutonic Knights found themselves confronting attacks from directions they had not anticipated, while their central assault had slowed against organized resistance. By carefully pacing their engagement, the Polish-Lithuanian commanders had turned the Teutonic reliance on direct confrontation into a liability. The battle at this stage was no longer merely a test of armor and lance. It was a contest of will and adaptability. Soldiers on both sides felt the tension acutely. Fear, anticipation, and the strain of prolonged contact under the unrelenting sun. Mistakes were costly. Hesitation could be fatal. Yet the Polish-Lithuanian forces maintained cohesion, while the Teutonic Order, despite its legendary discipline, began to show cracks, small at first, in the form of misaligned charges, delayed reinforcement, and visible fatigue among units not used to being tactically outmaneuvered. By midday, the engagement had transitioned from a clash to a sprawling, multi-directional confrontation. The initial shock of a Teutonic charge had been blunted, their formation stressed, their momentum arrested. The battlefield had become a network of calculated pressures and responsive countermoves, with the Polish-Lithuanian forces steadily exploiting every tactical opening. Yet the outcome was far from certain. The battle still demanded decisiveness, coordination, and unflinching attention to timing. In this crucible of strategy and endurance, one truth became evident. The Teutonic Knights were facing not merely an enemy army, but an adversary that understood their strengths and exploited their weaknesses with precision. The stage was set for the turning point, the moment where anticipation, preparation, and tactical subtlety would converge to shatter the formidable reputation of one of medieval Europe's most feared military orders. As the sun reached its zenith over Grunwald, the battle had shifted from a measured test of strength to a critical contest of endurance, judgment, and adaptability. The Teutonic Order, long revered for its discipline and shock tactics, now confronted the cumulative pressure of a strategy designed to exploit their rigidity. Their initial momentum, which had promised a swift and decisive breakthrough, had stalled. The carefully orchestrated Polish-Lithuanian plan was beginning to impose itself on the field, not through overwhelming numbers alone, but through timing, terrain exploitation, and the gradual erosion of enemy cohesion. By early afternoon, the first signs of systemic collapse among the Teutonic Knights became apparent. Their flanks, drawn into the marshy edges of the battlefield and harassed by light cavalry, were no longer able to maintain alignment with the central advance. Communications, critical for coordinating a formation designed to move as a single, unstoppable mass, began to break down. Mounted messengers could not traverse the muddied paths quickly enough. Flags and horns were misread amid the noise of clashing steel and panicked horses, and minor errors amplified across the line. The very structure that had been the foundation of Teutonic battlefield success, the rigid, disciplined wedge, was now a liability. Vytautas' maneuvers were central to this unraveling. For hours, Lithuanian cavalry had feigned weakness, retreating under pressure only to loop around and strike unexpectedly from the sides. The effect was cumulative. Isolated detachments of knights found themselves surrounded on three sides, forced to fight in constrained spaces where their heavy armor and mass formations were less effective. The psychological strain on these knights was immense. Trained to advance with certainty and dominate, they now confronted unpredictability and resistance that felt deliberate and overwhelming. The discipline that had been their greatest asset began to feel like inflexibility and hesitation, rare among these warriors, crept into their ranks. Meanwhile, the Polish center, under Jagiełło's careful oversight, held firm. Every wave of Teutonic assault was met with coordinated countermeasures. Pikes braced to receive charges, infantry gradually trading ground while preventing penetration, and archers delivering precise volleys that targeted both riders and mounts. Jagiełło's presence was less about inspiration and more about maintaining organizational coherence. Reports from the flanks filtered in through messengers, and orders were adjusted in real time. This was a battle managed as much by observation and decision-making as by physical engagement, a chessboard of men and horses where the consequences of miscalculation were immediate and lethal. The turning point came in the late afternoon. Exhaustion and overextension had finally taken their toll on the Teutonic formations. Knights who had advanced deep into Lithuanian-controlled terrain were suddenly confronted with converging forces from multiple directions. What had begun as a disciplined wedge was now fragmented, with units unable to support each other effectively. The light cavalry attacks, combined with sudden countercharges by fresh Polish infantry and reinforcements from previously held reserves, created a vortex of pressure that the knights could not recover from. Panic, subtle at first, began to spread. Commanders attempted to rally their forces, but the chain of command had become strained, and orders were often too late or misinterpreted amid the chaos. At this critical moment, the full weight of the secret strategy, the meticulous orchestration of timing, terrain, and tactical reserve, revealed itself. The Polish-Lithuanian army had deliberately allowed the knights to commit to an initial frontal assault, absorbing the shock, and then struck at their vulnerabilities systematically. Encirclement was no longer theoretical. Entire contingents of knights were trapped between forested flanks and marshy ground, harassed relentlessly by mobile units. Armored horses, unable to maneuver in the restrictive terrain, fell under volleys of arrows. Knights, once confident in their invincibility, now found themselves isolated and unable to regroup. The shock of initial contact had dissipated, replaced by the unrelenting pressure of a coordinated and adaptive enemy.